Morning, everybody. Today is Unit 5, Day 6, and today we are going to be talking about the impact of Reconstruction and about the end of Reconstruction and what it looked like. Again, if we're looking at a timeline here, the Civil War ends in 1865, and this time period that we're going to be talking about here is roughly 1868 until 1877, which is what generally historians mark as the end of the Reconstruction era. So one of the things I have you start out with here is I want you to look at this cartoon here. This is actually one that was used on the AP exam several years ago as a short answer question showing the difference in the Reconstruction government and then the government that would come after Reconstruction. So make sure you're familiar with that cartoon there from Puck magazine. All right. So what was the effect of the Civil War on African Americans? Of course, African Americans were able to serve in the military following the Emancipation Proclamation. They did get to serve in contraband armies and aboard Union Navy ships. You're going to see often that slaves would escape and get their freedom as Union troops approached. And again, that's something that continued throughout the war, and especially near the end when word was getting around that the South probably was going to be losing the war. Many did fight with distinctions. Eventually, they would get pay that was equal to those of white soldiers, but you can see at the beginning of the war, or when they were able to fight, they were not getting the same pay as white soldiers. If you ever have a chance to see the movie Glory, they have a very good scene that kind of shows that and how African Americans pushed back against that they weren't getting the same wage as whites. And I really like there is a line in that movie. I think Denzel Washington says it and says, "A black body can stop a bullet just as good as a white one." And to me, that one really, that's very, very impactful in the point that, hey, we should be getting paid the same exact thing. All right, so 15th Amendment, we talked about how at the end of the Civil War, we had the 13th Amendment passed to end slavery, 14th Amendment, which granted equal rights to African Americans, and then the last of the three, what are known as the Civil War amendments, is going to be the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment forbade either the federal government or the states from denying citizens the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Now, the amendment is a little bit vague and does leave room for poll taxes, property requirements, and literacy tests. And again, you might be wondering why didn't they just go ahead and knock that out? Well, poll taxes, property requirements, and literacy tests were something that were also being used in the North as a way to keep immigrants and other groups that people there didn't like from voting. So that's why there isn't a strong condemnation of that in the 15th Amendment because those were being used in the North. And again, the South would use those as well. The amendment would pass Congress. Congress requires Virginia, Mississippi, Tennessee, or Texas, and Georgia all to ratify it in order to be readmitted to the Union. And this is going to be one of the reasons why you're going to see there's a lot of pushback against especially the 14th and the 15th Amendment after the war, because those amendments required to be passed as a condition of those states coming back in the Union. So some people felt like those amendments were not truly reflective of what the country wanted because they were states forced to ratify those in order to be able to rejoin the Union. So that's why you'll see a little bit of controversy around those amendments during that time, at least. Women's suffrage. You're going to see that this is going to cause problems, the 15th Amendment, within the women's suffrage movement. Because remember, since the Second Great Awakening, women had really been pushed, and they had been at the leading front of pushing for the end of slavery. And when the 15th Amendment is passed, you're going to see that there are some women, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who feel very, very abandoned and betrayed by the 15th Amendment because they had worked so hard for the freedom of slaves, and now these freed slaves were going to get the right to vote before women would have the right to vote. And you're going to see, again, that's going to cause a lot of hurt feelings by women who say like, hey, man, we pushed, we did a lot of hard work, and now we still don't have the right to vote in the end. In 1869, you'll see this is going to lead to debate at the Equal Rights Association. Frederick Douglass would plead for understanding, saying that if women had been treated as poorly as slaves would, that they would truly understand. I think this is a point in history where we could say where you can understand why women would be upset, but also you can understand why slaves would be happy, former slaves would be happy that they had the right to vote now. So again, this is going to cause conflict within the women's suffrage movement. All right, so what was the effect of the war on women? You're going to see that women often manage the home and family with very scarce resources, especially in the South. Again, many men had gone away to fight in the war, and women were left to kind of pick up the pieces and deal with it. Often women face poverty and hunger. Again, you're going to see this even more so in the South, as evidenced by the bread riots that would happen in Richmond, Virginia. Again, we talked about before how inflation got really, really bad in the South, and because of that, people couldn't afford basic necessities such as bread. So you're going to see women that would march on Richmond. They would march on the Capitol in Richmond. They would be turned away there, and then they would start attacking stores and government warehouses. So there was a lot of discontent from women over basically the conditions that they were having to live in. You will see women, though, who do take on new roles during the war effort in agriculture. Again, a lot of them being forced to learn how to farm and learn how to do things that their husbands previously would have done. Nursing, Clara Barton there, you're going to see for the first time that women actually can come to a battlefield and serve as a nurse there. Previously, that had been something that people saw as, hey, war is something that's too gross and vile for women to be around, but women would serve as nurses, and also women working in the war industry, especially in the North, in the factories there. Now, like I said, women's rights advocates were very, very upset about the 15th Amendment, and this would lead to a divide. Some of the people that were upset, Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone, they would actually organize into the American Women's Suffrage Association. Though Stanton and Anthony, they would form their own group called the National Women's Suffrage Association, which only accepted women. And again, now you're going to see, even though you have the split in the women's suffrage movement, you're going to see that the goal for both of these groups now is to totally focus on a women's suffrage amendment. You can kind of say that the slavery issue had been dealt with, and now their focus was purely on women being able to get the right to vote. All right, so what were the social effects for the common soldier? You're going to see that oftentimes during the Civil War, you do have hand-to-hand combat. Yes, there was a lot of shooting back and forth, but because of the gunnery and that kind of thing during that time and the limited amount of shots, a lot of times you're going to see armies fighting face-to-face against each other. Again, the bayonet was still used quite often during the Civil War. You're going to see that after the war, this again is going to be especially true in the South. Soldiers return home to find their families destroyed, or their homes destroyed, and their families living in poverty. And when we talk about the total effects of the war, you're going to see that it really does have long-lasting effects in the South because of things like this. Soldiers on both sides would live with permanent disabilities. Again, medicine was not great during the Civil War. We talked about how the majority of soldiers that died actually died due to disease and that kind of thing. And one of the things, because even though the weaponry was still kind of behind, you didn't have a lot of automatic repeating weapons or semi-automatic repeating weapons, you're going to see that the Minet ball during the war did a lot of damage. And usually when it would go in, it would shatter the bone. And the way that they would fix that back then is they would usually amputate. So that's why you see the pictures here of all of these soldiers with a lot of amputations as a result. And really, you can say these guys are true warriors because they actually survived. Because quite frequently during that time, if you did have an amputation, you would usually die of gangrene or some other related infection or illness as a result of that. Another thing to mention here is that because of the disparity in population between the North and the South, you're going to see that the South really struggled to recover from the Civil War because of the amount of men that died in the South as a result of that. There's a really great book I've read called Confederates in the Attic, where an author, Tony Horowitz, he goes to the South and basically just tries to figure out why the Civil War is still important in the South. And he talks about in that book, because of the massive amount of men that you had die in the South, according to the ratio of the population, that's why going to be why you're going to see that the South kind of holds on to the Civil War. So the South will be struggling with that as well, the loss of population. So Republican rule in the South. I remember we talked about the radical Republicans. They had put in place their land. You're going to see between their plan between 1868 and 1871, all Southern states had rejoined the Union. Republican organizations were in power and protected by federal troops. And you see that African Americans would make up a large number of supporters of the Republican Party in the South. Now, you're going to hear two terms come out of this. If you're somebody like I have that's lived in the South and has family that's a little bit more old school, you probably have heard the term carpetbaggers before. This term comes from the Civil War, and carpetbagger were Northern whites who moved to the South. They were called that because the suitcases during that time were these bags made out of carpet, and they carried all their property in these cheap suitcases. They usually came to the South in order to try to make a profit as a result of Reconstruction and the South rebuilding. You're going to see that carpetbaggers were hated all across the South by Southerners who viewed carpetbaggers as basically coming to the North to take advantage of the South since the South was in such a bad shape. Again, if you hear the word carpetbaggers today, my grandpa used to use it when talking about Northerners that moved to the South. That's what they're talking about, people that moved from the North to the South. A scalawag, that is a Southern white that supported Reconstruction. Scots-Irish, that's where the term comes from for a runty, worthless animal is what they called a scalawag. Oftentimes, you're going to see the scalawags would be made up of former slave owners, ex-whites, Democrats, and mostly yeoman farmers. You might wonder, why did yeoman farmers support Reconstruction? The reason that they supported it is they saw it as, maybe this was an opportunity for them to be able to advance themselves. So what was life like in the Reconstructed South? You're going to see the African-American leaders would emerge in the South and prove to be very capable leaders. You'd have hundreds of African-Americans that would serve in government as elected representatives and leaders. There's a picture, an example of some of these new African-American leaders that you would have in the House of Representatives. Republicans hoped to create economy in the South like in the North. Property taxes and higher taxes were used to try to improve the South internally. And again, remember, that's something the South had pushed very much against, is the internal improvements, the high taxes, and all that. Another big area that you're going to see that the North really pushes on the South is education. Schools were built to help improve education in the South, and really you're going to see the first movement towards public schooling in the South as a result of the Civil War. Again, before this, largely education had been reserved for the wealthy in society, and along the lower classes, usually they went to elementary school or grade school, and that was it. That is going to be one of the big ways that the North is going to try to basically change how the South looks, is through education. And again, in a lot of ways, you're going to see that even today in areas in the deep, deep South, that there's still not enough education funding and that kind of stuff. There's still a lot of people that don't see a ton of value in education, even though that mindset has largely changed. African Americans, they would leave white churches during this time and form their own version of churches. If you've ever wondered why, when we look at churches today, there is this racial divide a lot of times in churches. A lot of that comes after the Civil War. The African Americans wanted the freedom to be able to worship how they wanted to worship and get out of some of those old constraints that they had from the old system of slavery. Land. We talked about how Sherman's Special Field Order 15, that was overturned by President Johnson. Most African Americans would struggle to acquire lands, and some states, such as South Carolina, created land commissions, but few of these land commissions are actually very successful. There would be a Southern version of the Homestead Act of 1866, which offered 80-acre grants of land to settlers. It was limited strictly to freedmen and Southern Unionists in the first year. This, though, would not be very successful because a lot of the land that they offered was not in very great areas. And so you don't see a large scale people using this because really they couldn't use much of the land, or the land wasn't self-sustaining. All right, sharecropping. This system is going to be created after the Civil War, and I would argue in a lot of ways that if the South had realized that they could do sharecropping, or if the rich plantation owners had realized they could do this, they probably would have gotten rid of slavery early, because you're going to see that this sharecropping system has a lot of disadvantages for African Americans, not just African Americans, though, but also poor whites working in the South. So freedmen started out landless. Think about this. You're a freed slave at the end of the war. You don't have any land. You don't have a lot of options about what to do. You do know your former slave owner, and so that represents opportunity that you could work for them. As we talked about before, wage labor did become the norm for freed slaves working in the South. So sharecropping was a system in which freedmen would work as renters. They would rent land, maybe from their former slave owner, maybe from somebody else, exchanging labor for the use of land, house, and farming supplies. So renters would pay half to 2/3 of their crops to the owner of the land. So basically, again, to sum this up, they are renting land, and as part of that rent, they're trading like their labor and that kind of thing, but they can bear the fruits of that land. Now, on the surface, you might say, oh, that doesn't seem too bad, but let's get into it and actually talk about what this looked like. So the big issue of sharecropping is that sharecroppers started with no money. So often they had to borrow money for food and supplies and all that kind of things. Country storekeepers would offer to supply the renter, supply the renter of the land, but often took out a lien on the crop as collateral. So this would leave the renter stuck with the storekeeper. So basically, what the African American or the sharecropper is doing is he's having to take out loans from a storekeeper, or he might be having to take out loans from the guy that actually owns the land. And the deal was that if you, at the end of the season, once your crop is produced on your land that you're renting, and you get your profit, you will pay me off, you'll pay me for the rent and all that kind of stuff at the end of the season. Now, seemingly, that seems like it would be okay, but here are some issues that you're going to have. For one, decline in cotton prices would happen. That would leave many in massive debt. This could lead to forced labor known as peonage. And really what this works out to in the end is that you're going to have a system where you are going to have former slaves, poor whites that are in perpetual debt. And basically that limits their freedom, because if you think about it, you're in perpetual debt. You can't leave. You have these debts that you have to pay to the person that owns the land. So really it is another form of slavery in a sense. But now it's incorporating not just African Americans, but also poor whites as well, who are being subject to this because they are in perpetual debt. And I will say, just speaking really quickly of debt, I'm sure that many of you probably don't have any debt. But when you are in debt, it's almost like you are somewhat in slavery to that lender. And that is exactly what is happening with the system of sharecropping. It's going to keep people in a cycle of poverty and in a cycle of dependence upon somebody else. So you're going to see that in a lot of ways, the South is kind of returning to the way things were before the war, just without the official, having slavery. Now, I talked about before how after the war that you're going to see that Lincoln really worried about the South having a lot of animosity and what that would do to the country. And you are certainly going to see that bear out in a lot of different ways. And I think one of the best ways you're going to see it is actually in some music. I mean, there's going to be a lot of writing and stuff. This song right here would come out in the late 1860s, "Oh, I'm a Good Old Rebel." And in this song, if you read through this, you can see that this song, written again from a Southern perspective, is going to be full of a lot of hate for the North at the end of the war. I bolded some of the lyrics here. You can see it says, "The lying, thieving Yankees, I hate 'em wuss and wuss. And I don't want no pardon for what I was and am. I won't be reconstructed, and I do not care." You can see what it ends with there. So you're going to see that there is a lot of anger in the South, and there's going to be more songs that come out like this of people who are very upset. Again, if you look there in the third stanza of this, "I hate the Yankee nation and everything they do. I hate the Declaration of Independence too. I hate the glorious Union dripping with our blood." So one of those things that Lincoln really wanted to avoid, you're going to really have those feelings bubble to the surface in the South, and nothing's really going to be done about it. And I think that's why you're going to see kind of the South gets held back as far as Reconstruction, because of a lot of this anger towards the North. So the beginning of the end of Reconstruction. Ex-Confederates, again, still angry. You will see some of them mount what they call a counter-revolution. And no, this isn't like a war revolution. This is going to be more of a political revolution. And this group of people are call themselves the Redeemers, because they were going to redeem the South and restore the Democratic Party to power in the South. One of the earliest examples of this is going to be the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan in Pulaski, Tennessee. Nathan Bedford Forrest would be one of the early leaders of this, who had formerly been a Confederate general. And the whole early purpose of the KKK was to promote the Democratic Party. The Klan started to terrorize and murder Republican sympathizers. And again, a lot of times those Republican sympathizers were black. They also did go after whites and then try to intimidate them as well into voting for the Democratic Party. You're going to see, though, that the KKK doesn't last super long in Tennessee. It would disband once the Democrats are put back in power in Tennessee. You'll see the KKK largely disbands, but it would continue in other places. But as far as in Tennessee, it would disband. And you can see in this political cartoon down here showing the KKK represented as this donkey pulling out and hanging some Ohio carpetbaggers, which would have likely been Republicans. But that's the early start of the KKK as a way to promote the Democratic Party in Tennessee. And we'll come back to the KKK in later units. Again, you can see here another political cartoon here showing a Union soldier here in the South helping protect a African American there. So how does the federal government respond to the Ku Klux Klan? They would pass the Ku Klux Klan in 1871, and it would be designed to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments by authorizing federal prosecutions, military intervention, and martial law to suppress terrorist activities. This would be successful in some of the southern states, but overall, it's going to show the weakness of reforms without the federal government enforcing it. The federal government had to be there to enforce it. The states really weren't super worried about enforcing it in the South. Again, the law was very, very difficult to enforce due to all-white juries, unsympathetic federal judges. And so really, you're going to see this law doesn't have much power. And by 1876, it is going to be struck down in the Supreme Court, which calls it unconstitutional, saying it was giving the federal government too much power and power that the federal government did not have during that time. Meanwhile, you're going to see as time is moving on, Republican governments in the South are losing support and falling to the Democrats. And by 1876, you're going to see there's only 3 Republican Reconstruction governments left: South Carolina, Louisiana, and Florida. That's going to be very important when we get to the election of 1876. You're going to see here, this is a political cartoon at the top that has been used on the AP exam before. And this is showing the KKK and the White League here working together. And it's hard to see because of the size of this, but it actually says worse than slavery. It shows them joining hands and working together and what they are doing to African Americans. And again, I mentioned the two parties and how they are viewed during this time. And you can see this is at the bottom here, a political cartoon at the bottom. And I would say this likely would have been run in the North. It might have been even run in the South as well. And it shows the two platforms. And you can see the Democratic platform here represents the white man, the Republican platform representing a caricature of a black man there. And again, this is how a lot of people might have viewed the two parties during that time. And I think this was a way that they would have used, especially in the South, to get support for the Democratic Party by saying, look, the Democratic Party represents you, the Republican Party does not. So one of the big things and one of the failures of Reconstruction is you're going to see that the North would largely lose interest in Reconstruction. Sympathy in the North began to wane for African Americans. You're going to see racism would be rampant. As I said, even before the Civil War and during the Civil War, that you did not have a lot of sympathy for African Americans in the North. In 1873, James K. Pike would write what was called the Prostrate State and describe South Carolina as a mass of black barbarism. Charles Sumner's key civil rights bill that he had passed in 1870 is stripped of a lot of its key provisions and later found unconstitutional. And a lot of people view former slaves as dependents on the federal government. If you look again at this political cartoon here from this time period, it says the Freedmen's Bureau, an agency to keep the Negro in idleness at the expense of the white man. And that's how a lot of people begin to view the Freedmen's Bureau. And again, people in the North and the South. A lot of people also start to see the Republican Party as very corrupt. The Republican Party had been in power since 1861, since the beginning of the Civil War. People started to see corruption, and part of that is due to the Grant administration, which we'll discuss here in a minute. And people start to worry about that, and instead of worrying about Reconstruction. And then, again, that whole idea of wage slavery, that working for a wage was similar to slavery, that becomes an issue. And you're going to start to see that labor unions grow as a result, and people start demanding an 8-hour workday. Now, during this time, you are going to see liberals emerge. Now, this isn't like liberal and conservative that like we look at today. Again, these are your classical liberals, as they would be called, liberals that believed in free trade, market competition, limited government. They emerge in response to the growth of the federal government. And as I said, we kind of have these checkpoints in U.S. history. We're going to see big growth in the federal government. One of them would be during the presidency of Andrew Jackson. And again, a lot of that growth during his presidency comes as a result of him growing the powers of the presidency. The next big growth of the federal government, though, is going to be the Civil War. A lot of liberals denounce universal suffrage as leading to a government of ignorance and vice. And so you're going to see, again, when you're looking at classical liberals, they would be similar to what we would call a conservative today, because the classical conservative believes a lot of these things. So that brings us to the election of 1872. Influential Republicans are dissatisfied with Grant through his first term. Again, Grant administration is going to have a lot of scandals during it, which we'll talk about. They break away and form what is known as the Liberal Republican Party. And again, this is going to be a Republican Party that's based in these liberal ideals of a limited government and free market economics. Horace Greeley from the New York Tribune would be their candidate. The Democrats would also nominate Greeley because they were still in disarray. So Greeley, not the greatest of candidates for this. You're going to see, again, look at the mess that the Democratic Party is here. You would think they would have learned from the 1860 election where they get defeated because of how divided they are. But because they are so divided, you're going to see that Grant would easily win the election in 1872. 1873, you're going to have a financial panic due to the bankruptcy of the Northern Pacific Railroad and its main investor, Jay Cooke, who had been a very, very wealthy railroad man. He had helped finance a lot of the Civil War, and the government had helped provide subsidies for his railroad as a result. The American people, as they always do when you have an economic downturn, they generally blame the presidency and whoever is in power during that time. And you're going to see the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company goes bankrupt as well. So you're going to have a lot of freedmen that lose any, savings that they might have had. That brings us to 1875 to the Whiskey Ring scandal. And again, this is under the Grant administration. The Whiskey Ring had been a network of liquor distillers and treasury agents. And basically it comes out that they had defrauded the government of millions of dollars in excise taxes. Excise taxes meaning basically taxes on whiskey. Their leader had been a Grant appointee and was Grant's personal secretary, Orville Babcock. He was involved. You're going to see that many involved with the scandal would go to jail, except for Babcock. They think that actually Grant likely perjured himself and lied under oath to help protect Babcock. And when you're looking at Grant, his administration is going to be known to history. Him and a Warren G. Harding, who we'll talk about in the 1920s. Generally, historians look at their administrations as being very, very corrupt. Not necessarily their fault, just the people that they surrounded themselves with had a lot of corruption. That's how people are going to view Grant. And even today, Grant is viewed as a lot better of a general than he was as president. That brings us to 1876. The Republicans would nominate Rutherford B. Hayes of Ohio. Again, they try to nominate somebody that doesn't have any scandals attached with his name to try to get away from that image that they had been built up under the Grant administration. The Democrats would nominate Samuel J. Tilden of New York, who was known for cleaning up politics in New York City. So you're going to see, again, the Democrats are going to pick somebody who has kind of a squeaky clean record as well, again, to show that contrast with the Republican Party that was in charge. Tilden publicly favored home rule for the South. Hayes did as well. He just didn't really talk about that very much. And home rule meant basically the South was going to be governing itself. The Democrats would accuse the Republicans of being corrupt. And again, a lot of that comes out of the Grant administration. So the votes would come in. And remember how I talked about earlier, there were three Southern governments that still had Reconstruction, that were still Reconstruction governments: Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. Now, in this, you're going to see Tilden would take key northern states, and Republicans would realize that if they could hold Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, that Hayes would win the elections. Now, Republicans would claim Democratic corruption in these states and certify Republican victories. So you're going to have this weird situation here where the Democratic candidate wins in these three states in the South, but the Republicans are just saying, oh, no, the election was corrupt in those three states, and they're going to certify their own electoral votes. So basically, you're going to have these three states in the South that are sending two different forms of electoral votes to Congress. Republican votes and Democratic votes. So like I said, newly elected Democrats, they send in the electoral votes for Tilden in those. So Congress would meet in 1877. And has two sets of electoral votes. Again, there's nothing really in the Constitution about what do you do in this situation when a state sends two sets of electoral college votes. So Congress would appoint an electoral commission to settle the question. There would be 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans. One member selected with no party ties. You're going to see that one guy with no party ties actually does lean Republicans. He would disqualify himself to accept a Senate seat. So Republican-leaning SCOTUS judge is picked. So again, what do you think is going to happen? There's more Republicans on this committee than Democrats. What's going to be the likely direction they're going to head? Surprise, surprise, the commission would side with the Republicans. Like I said, that's not a huge surprise there. And you can see those 3 states in the South, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, all go for the Democrat or the Republican Hayes. So Hayes would win the election. Again, look at the popular vote there, how tight the popular vote was. And then the electoral vote there, that Hayes wins by 1 electoral college vote over Tilden. Democrats controlled the House, and they attempt to stall the final count of the electoral votes to prevent Hayes' inauguration on March 4th. You will see with this, today we hear a lot about, a stolen election, a corrupt election in our current political environment, and you're going to hear the same coming out of that. So as a way to try to appease both sides, there would be secret talks occurring between Southern Democrats and Ohio Republicans. And in secret, they would reach an agreement which would be known as the Compromise of 1877. And again, this was a secret agreement. This wasn't something that was an official government compromise. They come to this agreement on March 1st. The vote would happen, and because of this agreement that they would have, Hayes would be elected, and all is right in the world today. But you're going to see that this marks the end of Reconstruction, because as part of this compromise that they come up with, basically the compromise was, look, these 3 states in the South, they will vote for Hayes, but we want an end of the military occupation of the South. We want all these old Republican Reconstruction governments gone, and we want to return to home rule, which is something we had talked about before. So you're going to see Reconstruction at this point is dead. So with the election of 1876 and this compromise of 1877, Reconstruction is done. Hayes orders Union troops back to the barracks. Republican governors flee in South Carolina and Louisiana, and the Democrats take back control. So when you're looking at Reconstruction, you really got to evaluate Reconstruction and look in the end, how did it work out for people? How did it work out for everybody involved? And how did the whole Civil War work out for everybody involved? And I really want you to look at these groups: African Americans, Northern Southerners, and women. In the end, after the Civil War and Reconstruction, were things really better in the end? You could argue African Americans, yes, into slavery, that is fantastic. But does what replaced slavery in the South, does that make things any better? Yes, there's freedom, but now you're going to have debtor slavery basically in the South. So when we're looking at Reconstruction, really think about what is the legacy of Reconstruction. Could the politicians after the Civil War maybe have gone farther in trying to protect the rights of African Americans? Like, what could we have done to really grow from the Civil War and learn from what happened? And these are questions that you really need to think about and contemplate. And I think really in the end, the legacy of Reconstruction is that not enough was done, and that Americans really got tired of, if you think about it, since basically 1860, Americans had been dealing with this divide between North and South. Even though the Civil War ends in 1865, this drags on to 1877. And people lose patience very, very quickly. And that's really what's going to happen with the Reconstruction. So I encourage you to take a critical look at this and kind of evaluate, like, was the Civil War and Reconstruction worth it in the end? I would argue, yeah, that it was worth it in some ways in the end. But in other ways, you're going to see that things kind of go back to looking like they did before the Civil War. So really give it a critical eye and examine it, and think about it in your own head. Like, what do you think the real result of all this was? So hope you have a great day. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I would love to answer them.